If you camped in Canada over the last 60 years, you knew the name Glendale, the Golden Falcon, the Titanium, more Canadian-built trailers than any other maker, names that meant summer and a family heading north. Behind those names was a factory in Strathroy, Ontario, more than 200,000 square feet, Canada's largest RV manufacturer, an estimated 120,000 units on the road. They survived 3 factory fires, survived free trade and the American imports that captured 85% of the Canadian market, survived 60 years of ownership changes, competition, and recession. And then, after 6 decades of building in Strathroy, the line went quiet for the last time. How does a debt-free company with $11 million in the bank simply disappear? What happened on Queen Street? Chapter 1. The Barn on the Curve. The story begins with an Englishman and a barn. Reginald Lever Thorne was a trailer builder from England, a man who'd learned his trade in a country that was still rationing food and clearing bomb rubble when he decided to leave it. He arrived in Canada around 1948 with his wife Joan, their young son Jeremy, and a friend named Vic Gray. And like a lot of post-war immigrants who'd crossed an ocean with more ambition than certainty, he didn't stop moving once he landed. The 4 of them traveled across the country, British Columbia, the East Coast, the long stretches in between, looking for the right place to put down and build something. They found it in southwestern Ontario, in the small city of London, where the farmland flattened out between Lake Huron and Lake Erie, and a man with a set of skills and a willingness to work with his hands could still afford to start. What Reg Thorne knew how to build was travel trailers. In post-war England, that meant cramped holiday caravans towed behind modest cars on narrow roads. In post-war Canada, it meant something different. The country was enormous. The roads were being paved as fast as the provinces could lay asphalt. Families who'd spent the war years saving and sacrificing were discovering that they owned a continent, and they wanted to see it from something more comfortable than a canvas tent. The market for recreational trailers in the late 1940s wasn't an industry yet. It was a collection of small builders, most of them working out of barns and garages, hammering together plywood shells on steel frames and selling them to neighbors. Reg Thorne was one of them. His first workshop was a barn on what locals called the Glendale Curve, the bend where Warncliffe Road met Southdale Road on the southern edge of London. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build trailers in, and it gave the company the name it would carry for the next 60 years. Glendale. Not named after a town, not after a family. Named after a curve in the road where an English immigrant set up shop and started building. The timing was nearly perfect. Canada's post-war economy was expanding in every direction. Housing, highways, consumer goods, and recreational travel was moving from luxury to expectation. A working family in Ontario could buy a Glendale trailer, hitch it to the back of a Ford or a Chevy, and drive their children to a lake in the Canadian Shield for 2 weeks every August. Reg Thorne wasn't building luxury goods. He was building the Canadian summer. Through the early 1950s, Glendale grew steadily from that barn. Thorne built travel trailers and mobile homes, the manufactured housing that was filling trailer parks and rural lots across the province as fast as builders could produce them. He hired local tradesmen. He learned the Canadian market, which demanded heavier construction and better insulation than anything he'd built in England. Because a trailer that couldn't survive a southwestern Ontario winter wasn't going to sell twice, and he sold them the way a small-town builder sells anything. Personally, face-to-face, often right off the shop floor. Decades later, a Strathroy native would recall online that, "Back in the 60s, my dad went right to the factory and bought our first Glendale from Reg Thorne directly." The founder shaking hands with the buyer. The builder standing behind what he'd built. Then the barn burned down. In 1956, a fire destroyed the London workshop, the original Glendale plant on the curve that had given the company its name. Everything Reg Thorne had built in 6 years went up in smoke. It was the kind of setback that finishes most small businesses. A man with less stubbornness or less confidence in what he was building might have taken the insurance money and found a job somewhere else. Thorne didn't. He looked west, about 35 kilometers down the road from London, to a small railway town in Middlesex County called Strathroy. Chapter 2. Queen Street. Strathroy in the mid-1950s was the kind of town that doesn't exist in the same way anymore. A place that made sense because the railway ran through it. The Great Western Railway had put Strathroy on the map in the 19th century, and by the time Reg Thorne arrived looking for a new home for his trailer company, the town had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a small Ontario municipality. Agriculture on every side, a main street with shops and churches, a population of a few thousand people who mostly knew each other and mostly stayed. What Thorne found there was a property at 145 Queen Street, a building with enough space to restart production and enough land around it to grow. He moved Glendale to Strathroy, and 145 Queen Street became the company's home for the rest of its life. More than half a century. Every Glendale trailer, every Golden Falcon, every titanium fifth wheel that would eventually roll across Canada, all of them traced their lineage back to that address. It was a good fit, the town and the company. Strathroy Caradoc sat in the heart of Middlesex County, surrounded by some of the richest agricultural land in Ontario, corn and soybeans mostly, with tobacco and ginseng in the sandier soils to the south. The town had grown up around the railway, and by the 1950s, it had the kind of diversified small-town economy that kept people employed without making anyone rich. Food processing, light manufacturing, the service businesses that catered to the surrounding farm country. A trailer manufacturer wasn't exotic in a place like that. It was just another business that hired people who were good with their hands, paid them a wage they could raise a family on, and shipped something useful out the door at the end of each day. The rebuild wasn't instant. Thorne had to re-equip, rehire, and re-establish the supply chains that the fire had severed. But the market hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, the late 50s were even hungrier for trailers than the early 50s had been. The Trans-Canada Highway was under construction. It wouldn't be completed until 1962, but sections were opening every year, stitching the country together in a way that made recreational travel not just possible, but irresistible. Provincial parks were expanding, campgrounds were filling, and the baby boom was putting families into station wagons and sending them north, east, and west, with trailers hitched behind. A key early employee who helped Thorne rebuild was Wally Callahan. The historical record is thin on Callahan's specific role, the kind of archival gap that's common with small-town manufacturers whose records were kept in filing cabinets, not databases. But his name surfaces consistently in accounts of Glendale's early years as someone who helped build the company from the inside. In a business where the founder was personally selling trailers to neighbors, the people who worked alongside him in the first decade weren't employees in the modern corporate sense. They were partners in everything but title. By the early 1960s, Glendale had outgrown the trauma of the fire and was producing trailers at a pace that Reg Thorne's London barn could never have sustained. The Strathroy plant was expanding. The product line was diversifying. Travel trailers in multiple sizes, mobile homes for the booming manufactured housing market, and a growing reputation for quality that was beginning to carry beyond southwestern Ontario. Thorne was building something that hadn't existed when he'd arrived from England a dozen years earlier, a Canadian trailer brand with national ambitions. And then, because the history of Glendale Recreational Vehicles is a history that keeps catching fire and getting back up, the Strathroy plant burned in 1966. The second fire in a decade. The factory that Thorne had rebuilt after losing the London barn was destroyed again. A lesser company, a lesser founder, would have read the message. 2 catastrophic fires in 10 years. The insurance headaches alone would have been enough to walk away from. Reg Thorne rebuilt again. The new facility that rose at 145 Queen Street after the 1966 fire would become the modern Glendale plant, the building that would eventually stretch across more than 200,000 square feet, with 54 shipping doors and a parking lot big enough for 200 cars. The fire that should have ended the company instead gave it the factory that would make it famous. Chapter 3. Coast to Coast. What happened next was expansion, not the cautious, incremental kind, but the aggressive, continent-spanning kind that only makes sense if you understand how big Canada is and how far apart its markets sit. By 1959, Glendale had opened a division in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, more than 3,000 kilometers west of Strathroy, building both homes and travel trailers for the prairie and Western Canadian market. The logic was geographic. You couldn't efficiently ship a travel trailer from southwestern Ontario to the foothills of the Rockies. The freight costs would eat the margin. If you wanted to sell in the West, you built in the West. In 1961, Thorne partnered with John de Winter to open Glendale Atlantic Limited in Sussex, New Brunswick, reaching the Maritime Provinces. That operation acquired the McGuinness Homes name and launched the Golden Falcon line, a brand that would become one of the most recognized names in Canadian recreational vehicles. By 1965, there was a Glendale Quebec Limited in Saint-Joseph-de-Beauce, south of Quebec City. By 1968, a plant in Morris, Manitoba, and, back in Strathroy, a new Terrapin commercial building plant across Queen Street from the main factory, diversifying into prefabricated commercial structures alongside the core RV business. Glendale was building trailers in 5 provinces, and the Strathroy footprint was expanding to match. The speed of this expansion is worth understanding because it tells you something about the man and the moment. Reg Thorne was an English immigrant who'd started with a barn and lost it to fire. Within 2 decades of arriving in Canada, he was operating manufacturing plants from New Brunswick to Alberta. This wasn't corporate empire building driven by shareholders and quarterly reports. This was a trailer builder who understood that Canada's vastness was both the opportunity and the obstacle. That if you wanted to be a national brand, you had to be a national manufacturer, because the country was simply too large to serve from a single factory. In 1969, Thorne reached even further. Glendale Homes Pontre Limited acquired property in Australia, an international expansion that reflected either remarkable confidence or remarkable restlessness in a man who'd already crossed one ocean and built a company on the other side of it. In 1971, the company acquired pre-built Limited of Lethbridge, Alberta, along with the Scamper RV line, adding another established brand to a portfolio that was beginning to sprawl. The brands accumulated the way they do in growing manufacturing companies: Glendale, Glendette, Glenelle, Golden Falcon, Flight, Orbit, Falcon, Cottager, Scamper. Each served a slightly different market segment, a slightly different price point, a slightly different customer who wanted to see a slightly different name on the side of their trailer. But all of them were built in Glendale plants, by Glendale workers, to Glendale standards. The diversity of names masked a unity of manufacturing. In 1973, Glendale Mobile Homes Limited formally became the Glendale Corporation, a name that reflected what the company had become. And then, in 1975, Reg Thorne made the decision that founders eventually make. He sold Glendale to Morgan Firestone of Oakville, Ontario. The reasons aren't documented in accessible sources: whether Thorne was ready to retire, whether the company had grown beyond what one man could manage, whether the offer was simply too good to refuse. What's clear is that a quarter-century after an English trailer builder set up shop in a barn on a curve in the road, the company he'd built had become something larger than one person could hold. Thorne had survived 2 devastating fires, expanded across 5 provinces and into another hemisphere, and built a brand that Canadians recognized from coast to coast. The founder stepped back. The corporation carried on. Morgan Firestone reshaped what he'd bought. In 1978, his Firan Corpnars of Oakville amalgamated with Glendale to create Firan Glendale Corporation, and Firestone made a decision that would define the company's final 3 decades. He re-engineered it to focus solely on recreational vehicles, manufactured out of Strathroy. The mobile homes, the manufactured housing, the diversified product lines that Thorne had built. Firestone stripped them away and bet the company on RVs. It was a bet on a market that was growing, on a product category that Canadians were buying in record numbers, and on a factory in Strathroy that had the capacity to serve that market. In 1988, Firan Corp added another piece, acquiring Travelair of Red Deer, Alberta, a respected RV builder that had been operating since 1966. The Red Deer plant gave Glendale a Western manufacturing base again, this time dedicated entirely to recreational vehicles. But 1988 also brought something else. That year, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, the FTA that would reshape Canadian manufacturing more profoundly than any single policy decision since Confederation. For the RV industry, the consequences would take time to arrive, but they were already in the arithmetic. Canadian RV manufacturers served a market of 26 million people. American manufacturers, concentrated overwhelmingly in and around Elkhart County, Indiana, the self-proclaimed RV capital of the world, served a market 10 times that size and operated at volumes that no Canadian plant could match. The tariff wall had kept the playing field roughly level. When that wall began to come down, the math changed. By 1993, the numbers told the story plainly. E, a Canadian RV maker in Winkler, Manitoba, would later report on its own corporate history that by that year, American imports accounted for 85% of the RV business in Canada. 85%. In less than 5 years after the FTA, 4 out of every 5 recreational vehicles sold in Canada were built in the United States, most of them in Elkhart. Glendale survived this. It survived because it had something the imports didn't: a reputation for quality built over 4 decades, a loyal dealer network, vertical integration that let it control costs and standards, and a deep understanding of what Canadian RV buyers wanted. The company wasn't just competing on price. It was competing on craftsmanship, on the fact that a Glendale was built by Canadian hands in a Canadian factory to Canadian standards, and that if something went wrong, you could call Strathroy and talk to the people who'd built it. In 2003, Morgan Firestone sold his controlling interest to his senior management team. The parent company became Glendale International Limited, based in Oakville. For the first time in its history, Glendale was owned by the people who ran it, managers who'd come up through the factory, who understood the product, who knew the dealers and the customers. It should have been the beginning of a new chapter. Chapter 4. 200,000 square feet. The Strathroy factory at its peak was something to see. 200,000 square feet. That was the marketing number. And even if the real estate listing after closure measured the main building at closer to 163,000, the difference was accounted for by the Terrapin commercial building plant across Queen Street and the surrounding yard, loading areas, and storage that made the whole complex sprawl across nearly 20 acres. 54 shipping doors lined the building's exterior. A parking lot that held 200 cars filled and emptied twice a day with shift changes. From the road, it looked like what it was: the largest recreational vehicle manufacturing operation in Canada. What set Glendale apart from most of its competitors, and what the workers on the floor knew better than anyone, was that this wasn't an assembly plant. Glendale didn't bolt together components shipped in from suppliers the way most RV manufacturers did. Glendale manufactured. The company's own literature put it plainly. We don't just assemble RVs, we manufacture a great many of the items you will find in every new Glendale unit. That distinction mattered more than it might sound. In the RV industry, particularly in Elkhart, the standard model was assembly, buying pre-made cabinets, pre-formed tanks, pre-cut panels, and fastening them together on a line. It was efficient, it was fast, and it meant that one RV rolling off the line in Indiana was built from essentially the same supplier catalog as the next one, regardless of whose name was on the side. Glendale's approach was different. The company had been molding its own ABS plastic components since the early 1960s, a capability that began during a plastic shortage, when Reg Thorne's team couldn't source the water and septic tanks they needed and decided to make their own. They acquired vacuum-forming equipment and started producing ABS parts on site. What began as a workaround became a competitive advantage. By the time the Strathroy plant reached its peak, the vacuum-forming operation was turning out everything from holding tanks to interior trim pieces, all manufactured under the same roof where they'd be installed. Building an RV at Glendale drew on a full suite of skilled trades, and the factory floor reflected that complexity. Woodworking and cabinetry, because the interiors of a high-end travel trailer or fifth wheel demanded joinery and finishing that would hold up to years of road vibration and temperature swings. Electrical, running the wiring harnesses that powered everything from the lighting to the slide-out mechanisms. Plumbing, connecting the freshwater, graywater, and blackwater systems that made an RV a self-contained dwelling. Sheet metal and metalwork, forming the chassis components and exterior panels. Upholstery, cutting and sewing the fabrics that covered every seating surface and sleeping area. And fiberglass, composite, and plastics fabrication. The ABS vacuum forming that had been part of Glendale's identity since Reg Thorne couldn't buy a water tank and made one instead. A man or woman working the line at Glendale wasn't performing a single repetitive task. The nature of RV manufacturing, low volume, high complexity, enormous variation between models, meant that workers needed to understand their trade deeply enough to adapt. A cabinet maker building the interior of a 32-foot titanium fifth wheel was solving different problems than a cabinet maker working on a 24-foot travel trailer, even though both were building cabinets. The tolerances were tight, the materials were unforgiving, and the finished product had to survive being towed at highway speed across a country where the temperature could swing from -30 in February to +35 in July. Walking the floor at peak production meant moving through zones that each had their own sound and their own smell. The woodshop smelled of sawdust and the particular sweetness of freshly cut cabinet-grade plywood. The vacuum-forming area carried the sharp, chemical tang of heated ABS plastic, a smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home. The metalworking section rang with the clatter of sheet metal shears and the staccato of rivet guns. The upholstery shop was quieter, the hum of industrial sewing machines, the snap of scissors through vinyl, and carried the clean, synthetic scent of new fabric. And over everything, binding it all together, was the low, constant thrum of the ventilation system pushing heated air through a building that needed to stay warm enough to work in through the long southwestern Ontario winter, when the temperature outside could sit at -15 for weeks, and the concrete floor radiated cold through every pair of steel-toed boots on it. Reg Thorne had designed some of the early innovations himself. The Glendale and Golden Falcon models from the 1960s featured hidden storage compartments, clever uses of dead space that turned the dimensional constraints of a travel trailer into an advantage. A family packing for 2 weeks at a provincial campground needed somewhere to put everything, and Thorne understood that the difference between a trailer that felt cramped and one that felt livable often came down to storage that didn't announce itself. These weren't revolutionary engineering breakthroughs. They were the thoughtful touches of a builder who used his own products and understood what his customers needed before they asked for it. By the time the factory reached its full capacity, the Strathroy plant was producing 2 recreational vehicles per day on a single shift. That number sounds modest compared to the Elkhart operations churning out units by the thousand, and it was. But each of those 2 units carried more in-house manufacturing content than almost anything coming off an American line. The trade-off was speed for quality, volume for control. Every unit that rolled out of those 54 shipping doors carried the accumulated knowledge of a factory that had been building the same way, in the same place, for decades. Chapter 5. The Golden Falcon. Glendale's marketing claimed the company was the largest RV manufacturer in Canada, that it sold more recreational vehicles in Canada than any other maker, domestic or imported. The number they cited was staggering, an estimated 120,000 Glendale units registered and in use across North America. 120,000 trailers and motorhomes and fifth wheels bearing the Glendale name, parked in driveways and campgrounds and storage lots from British Columbia to Nova Scotia, from the Maritimes to the American Sunbelt. That number tells you something about the scale of what the Strathroy factory had produced over 5 decades. But it also tells you something about the loyalty. RVs aren't disposable goods. A well-built travel trailer can last 20, 30, even 40 years with proper maintenance. The fact that 120,000 Glendales were still on the road didn't just mean the factory had been productive. It meant the product had been good enough to keep. The brand that carried the most weight, the one that old-timers remembered first and enthusiasts collected most avidly, was the Golden Falcon. Launched from the Sussex, New Brunswick plant in the early 1960s under the partnership between Reg Thorne and John de Winter, the Golden Falcon became the Canadian travel trailer. One enthusiast, writing on a vintage RV forum, described it as what the Shasta is in the USA. the luxury model in the tin can ranks, the name that meant something, proudly made in Canada. Where Shasta trailers evoked California highways and American road trips, the Golden Falcon carried the weight of Canadian summers. Lakes in the Shield, campgrounds in the Rockies, the long pull across the prairies with the trailer swaying gently behind the family truck. The full brand portfolio had grown enormous over the decades. Glendale, Glendette, Glenelle, Golden Falcon, Flight, Orbit, Falcon, Cottager, Scamper, Royal Classic, Travelair, Holidaire, Rustler, Park Avenue. Each name addressed a different slice of the market. The Royal Classic Class C motorhomes, built on commercial van chassis, served buyers who wanted the convenience of a self-propelled vehicle. The Travelair line, acquired with the Red Deer plant, carried its own loyal following in Western Canada. The Scamper name, inherited from the Lethbridge acquisition, had history going back decades. But brands are just names on aluminum siding. What made Glendale matter to the people who bought its products, and what kept them coming back for their second and third units, was the sense that you were buying from a company that actually built what it sold. This wasn't a badge engineering operation where identical products wore different nameplates. The vertical integration that Glendale had maintained since Reg Thorne's first plastic shortage in the 60s meant that the workers in Strathroy had their hands on the product at a level that most manufacturers had long since outsourced. On RV enthusiast forums, where owners compared notes with the intensity of car collectors, Glendale consistently drew praise that went beyond product satisfaction into something closer to allegiance. Owners called the company one of the good guys. They called it one of the better makers. They didn't say it made the cheapest trailer. They said it made the one they trusted. That trust extended to the enthusiast community that formed around the brand. The Titanium RV Owners Group, run by Tony Lane out of Tillsonburg, Ontario, a small town just south of the Highway 401 corridor, became a gathering point for owners of Glendale's premium fifth wheel line. A vintage Glendale trailer group on Facebook collected photographs and stories from the earlier decades, when the Golden Falcons and Glendettes were new, and the idea of a Canadian-built trailer carried a quiet pride that didn't need to be stated. And the Tin Can Tourists, a North American vintage trailer preservation club, archived the 1986 interview that Lou Hamill of Sheridan College had conducted with Reg Thorne at his Strathroy home. One of the few surviving primary source records of the founder's own account of how the company began. Strathroy wasn't Elkhart. It didn't have the massive concentration of RV manufacturers, suppliers, and dealers that made Elkhart County the center of the North American industry. It was a small Ontario town where the largest employer happened to build recreational vehicles. But within the Canadian RV world, Strathroy carried a weight that was disproportionate to its size. It was where the trailers came from. If you drove a Glendale, and over 60 years, hundreds of thousands of Canadians did, there was one place in the country where your trailer had been born. One factory where the cabinets were cut, and the tanks were formed, and the wiring was run, and the whole thing was rolled out through one of those 54 shipping doors and loaded onto a transport for the dealer lot. 145 Queen Street, Strathroy, Ontario. For 6 decades, that was where Canada built its RVs. Chapter 6. The Cab Over. In the year 2000, 50 years after Reg Thorne set up shop in a barn on a curve in the road, Glendale marked the anniversary by doing what it had always done best. It built something new. The Titanium line of fifth-wheel trailers launched around 2001, and it was the most ambitious product the company had ever attempted. The engineering centerpiece was a patent-pending cab-over design that solved a problem fifth-wheel manufacturers had been working around for decades. A conventional fifth-wheel trailer has a raised front section that extends over the bed of the tow truck. That's the fifth-wheel coupling, borrowed from the trucking industry. But the space above the truck bed is constrained by the geometry of the hitch, and most manufacturers simply accepted that limitation, leaving the forward section cramped or using it only as a low-ceilinged sleeping area. Glendale's engineers didn't accept it. The Titanium's cab-over design reshaped the front cap into a smooth, aerodynamic profile that extended the usable interior space forward and upward. The result, as Heartland RV's Coley Brady would later describe it, was that a 32-foot trailer offers the same living area as a 37-footer because the nose of the trailer can accommodate a bedroom and wardrobe. 5 feet of living space, conjured from geometry and engineering, without adding 5 feet of trailer to tow, park, and maneuver. For owners who spent weeks or months living in their fifth wheels, and many did, particularly retirees who followed the season south to Arizona or Florida and back to Canada, those 5 feet were the difference between camping and living. The titanium wasn't cheap. Models ranged from roughly 29 feet to 42 feet, with as many as 4 or 5 slide-out sections that expanded the interior when parked. The finishes were premium: solid surface countertops, reclining chairs, a central vacuum system, ducted air conditioning, flat panel televisions. This was Glendale's answer to the top of the market, a product that said a Canadian manufacturer could build something as luxurious and innovative as anything rolling out of Elkhart. And the market agreed. The titanium dominated the Canadian fifth-wheel marketplace and built the kind of customer loyalty that product designers dream about and marketing departments can't manufacture. The mid-2000s were the peak, not just for Glendale, but for the entire North American recreational vehicle industry. By 2005, annual RV shipments across the continent had swelled to 384,400 units. The following year, 2006, they climbed higher still, 390,500. The most recreational vehicles ever shipped in a single year in North American history. Dealer lots were full. Campgrounds were booked. The highways hummed with trailers towed by trucks that burned diesel at prices nobody thought to question yet. What nobody talked about, at the peak, was how the whole system actually worked. Not the manufacturing. That was visible, tangible. A building you could drive past on Queen Street. What kept the industry running was invisible, and it was fragile. A recreational vehicle is one of the most expensive discretionary purchases a family can make. Dealers can't pay cash for a lot full of them, so the entire supply chain, factory to dealer to customer, ran on a specific form of wholesale credit called floor plan financing. A lender would pay the manufacturer when a unit shipped to the dealer. The lender took the inventory as collateral. The dealer repaid the loan, with interest, as each unit sold to a retail customer. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it meant that every trailer sitting on every dealer lot in the country represented not a sale completed, but a loan outstanding. The whole industry floated on credit the way a boat floats on water, invisibly, effortlessly, until the water disappears. In 2006, the water was still there. The lenders were lending. The dealers were stocking. The customers were buying. Glendale was debt-free. The factory was running. The titanium was selling. The management team that had bought the company from Morgan Firestone in 2003 was running an operation that had survived 3 major fires, a complete ownership transition, the onslaught of American competition after the FTA and NAFTA, and half a century of the ordinary pressures that destroy most manufacturing businesses before they reach their 20th birthday. 120,000 units on the road. 2 RVs rolling out of the Strathroy plant every working day. Canada's largest RV manufacturer, building the country's most sought-after fifth wheel, owned by the people who ran it. If you'd walked the floor of 145 Queen Street in the summer of 2006, heard the vacuum formers running, smelled the adhesive from the upholstery shop, watched a titanium being fitted out in the finishing bay, you wouldn't have seen a company in trouble. You'd have seen a company at the top of its craft, doing what it had done for 56 years, building things that Canadians hitched to their trucks and drove across the country they shared. You wouldn't have seen what was coming. Nobody did. Chapter 7. The water disappears. The first cracks didn't come from inside the factory. They came from the financial system that kept the factory's customers buying. In the summer of 2007, something began to break in the American mortgage market. Loans that should never have been made, subprime mortgages, packaged into securities and sold as safe investments to banks and pension funds around the world, started defaulting. The default spread, the securities collapsed, and the institutions that held them, or that had lent against them, or that had insured them, began to teeter. By the autumn of 2007, what had started as a problem in American housing had metastasized into a credit crisis that was freezing lending across every sector of the North American economy. The recreational vehicle industry was not, on the surface, connected to subprime mortgages. Nobody was buying a fifth-wheel trailer with a no-money-down adjustable-rate loan. But the industry was profoundly connected to credit, specifically to the wholesale floor plan financing that moved every unit from factory to dealer lot. And the institutions that provided that credit were the same institutions that were now hemorrhaging losses on mortgage-backed securities and pulling back from every lending line they could. CIT Group, one of the largest lenders to small and mid-sized businesses in North America and a major provider of dealer floor plan financing, was bleeding. It would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on November 1, 2009, one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. Textron Financial, another major floor plan lender, was exiting the dealer financing business entirely. GE Capital's Commercial Distribution Finance division was acquiring distressed lending portfolios, picking up Yamaha Canada's dealer financing in January 2009, absorbing an Arctic Cat portfolio worth more than $200 million in December. But acquiring portfolios from failing lenders is not the same thing as extending new credit to dealers who need it. The net effect was a contraction. The money that had flowed from lender to manufacturer to dealer was drying up. On dealer lots across North America, the impact was immediate and brutal. Tony Guideski, who ran Elkhart County RV in the heart of Indiana's RV manufacturing corridor, described it to MSNBC.com with the clarity of a man watching his business suffocate. "I cannot buy any new product unless I use my own money. None of the banks in this town will lend me money." That was Elkhart, the RV capital of the world, where roughly 80% of all North American recreational vehicles were built. If the banks wouldn't lend there, they wouldn't lend anywhere. The mechanism was invisible to the public, but devastating to the industry. A customer might walk onto a dealer lot in the spring of 2008, ready to buy a travel trailer, and find fewer models to choose from. Not because the factories had stopped building, but because the dealer couldn't afford to stock them. No floor plan credit meant no inventory. No inventory meant no sales. No sales meant no orders to the factory. The pipeline that connected the worker on the Strathroy floor to the family hitching up at a campground ran through a financing system that had seized. For Canadian dealers, the squeeze was double. Their American floor plan lenders were pulling back from the entire sector, and Canadian banks, more conservative by nature and by regulation, had never been as deeply committed to RV dealer financing in the first place. A Canadian dealer trying to stock Glendale units in the spring of 2009 faced the same credit wall that Tony Guideski was hitting in Elkhart, with fewer alternative lenders to turn to, and a domestic market that was a tenth the size of the American one. 3 other forces hit simultaneously, and each one made the others worse. The Canadian dollar reached parity with the American dollar on September 20, 2007, for the first time since 1976. By November of that year, it had spiked to roughly $1.10 US. For Canadian consumers, a strong loonie meant cheaper American imports. For Canadian manufacturers who exported to the United States, and the RV industry shipped across the border in both directions, it meant their products were suddenly more expensive in their largest foreign market. The competitive advantage that Canadian manufacturers had enjoyed when the dollar sat at 65 or 70 cents was gone. At parity, a Glendale trailer cost American dealers the same in US dollars as it cost in Canadian, with none of the discount that had made Canadian-built units attractive. Oil climbed toward $100 a barrel and kept climbing. Gasoline prices spiked. And recreational vehicles, large, heavy, aerodynamically indifferent objects towed by trucks that burned diesel by the liter, became harder to sell to families watching their fuel bills double. The mathematics of a summer road trip changed overnight. A family that had budgeted $500 for fuel to tow their trailer to the Rockies and back was suddenly looking at $1,000. The RV isn't a necessity, it's a dream. And dreams are the first thing families cut when the bills get heavy. Campgrounds that had been booked solid through July and August started showing vacancies. Dealer lots that had turned inventory quickly through the boom years now held units that sat for months, the sun fading their decals, the interest on their floor plan loans accumulating silently underneath. The numbers told the story with the finality of an autopsy. North American RV shipments had peaked at 390,500 units in 2006. They slipped to 353,400 in 2007, a decline, but not a collapse. Then the floor fell out. In 2009, shipments sank to 165,700, a drop of more than 50% from the peak. More than half the industry's volume gone in 3 years. In Elkhart County, manufacturing employment roughly halved, from about 60,000 jobs in January 2008 to fewer than 37,000 by January 2009. The devastation was so stark, so concentrated, that President Barack Obama chose Elkhart for one of his first major public appearances after taking office, delivering a stimulus speech in February 2009 to a community that had become a symbol of the recession's human cost. Tom Walworth of Statistical Surveys, who tracked the RV industry's sales data, put the structural diagnosis plainly. The inability to get product to the showrooms has played a large part in the demise of 9 RV manufacturers. 9 manufacturers dead. Not because they built bad products, not because their factories were inefficient, because the credit that connected them to their customers had been cut off at the source. Glendale, in Strathroy, Ontario, was watching all of this from across the border. Its dealers faced the same credit squeeze. Its customers faced the same fuel prices. And its products, priced in a Canadian dollar that had surged to parity, were competing against American-built units from manufacturers who operated at 10 times the volume and could absorb losses that would have destroyed a smaller operation. The order book was thinning. Dealers who had once stocked multiple Glendale models were cutting back to 1 or 2, or none, not because they'd lost faith in the product, but because they couldn't finance the inventory. The Travel Air plant in Red Deer felt it. The Strathroy floor felt it. The rhythm of 2 units a day that had sustained the factory for years was becoming harder to maintain when the units had nowhere to go. The factory was still running. The product was still good. The workers still arrived for their shifts on Queen Street. But the water was disappearing, and a factory that floats on credit can't float on quality alone. Chapter 8. $11 million and no way out. Here is the fact that makes this story different from every other recession casualty. For the 3 months ending August 28, 2009, just 5 months before the company died, Glendale's financial statements showed a company that was, by every conventional measure, healthy. No debt. Not a dollar of long-term debt on the books. Working capital of $11.5 million, including $2.4 million in cash. A 60-year-old Canadian manufacturer, family-rooted and management-owned, sitting on more than enough money to cover its obligations, with no creditors to appease and no leveraged buyout debt dragging it under. This wasn't a company that had been hollowed out by private equity. It wasn't a company that had borrowed recklessly to finance an expansion it couldn't sustain. It wasn't a company whose management had enriched themselves while the balance sheet deteriorated. Glendale was clean. Glendale was solvent. Glendale had money in the bank. And Glendale was dying anyway. CEO Edward Hanna, the chairman and chief executive who led the management team that had purchased the company from Morgan Firestone in 2003, had said publicly in the fall of 2009 that the decline in the RV industry appears to have leveled off. It was a reasonable statement at the time. The freefall of 2008 and early 2009 had slowed. There were signals from the American market that the worst might be over. Eleanor Ham, president of the Recreation Vehicle Dealers Association of Canada, would echo the same sentiment even as the industry's wreckage piled up around her. The data suggested a bottom, if not yet a recovery. But a bottom is not a floor you can build on if you're still losing money while you wait. Glendale's RV division had recorded just under $9 million in sales for the first 9 months of 2009, a figure that represented a collapse in revenue from the peak years. The company posted a net loss of roughly $3.1 million through those 3 quarters, on top of a $2.1 million loss in 2008. The $11.5 million in working capital wasn't growing. It was being consumed, quarter by quarter, by a factory that was still operating but selling into a market that had contracted by half. The workers knew. They'd been watching the line slow for months, and when the union contract came up for renegotiation in the fall of 2009, the members of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers at the Strathroy plant made a choice that tells you everything about how much that factory meant to the people who worked in it. They gave back. Martin Milhomans, the IAMAU representative, described the concessions to the Globe and Mail: $3.69 per hour in combined wage and benefit cuts. That was a cut of about $3 an hour in straight wages, bringing hourly pay down to roughly $16. $16 an hour to build recreational vehicles in a factory where the work demanded real skill: cabinetry, electrical, plumbing, metalwork, the full suite of trades that Glendale's vertical integration required. In Strathroy, $16 an hour was grocery money and a mortgage payment, and not much left over. A wage you could survive on, but not one you could build a future from. The workers took the cut because the alternative was no work at all. They traded money for time, hoping the time would be enough. For a while, it seemed like it might be. Through the fall of 2009, the Strathroy plant was still running, still building 2 recreational vehicles per day on a single shift. 2 units a day wasn't the pace of the golden years, but it was production. It was employment. It was a factory that hadn't given up. Then, on November 13, 2009, the line stopped. Glendale idled the Strathroy plant. The workers who'd taken $3.69 in givebacks, who'd cut their own wages to keep the factory alive, were sent home. The building that had been turning out titanium fifth wheels and golden falcons and royal classics fell silent. Not permanently, not yet. The idling was presented as temporary. But in manufacturing, the word temporary is the word that precedes permanent, more often than anyone wants to admit. The weeks that followed were the kind of waiting that hollows people out. 100 workers in Strathroy, 60 in Red Deer, sitting at home through a Canadian November and December, watching the phone and the news and the calendar. Some would have started looking for other work, but other work, in the middle of the worst recession since the 1930s, in a small Ontario town where the RV plant was one of the largest employers, wasn't easy to find. The skills they carried were real. A Glendale cabinet maker could build anything that required wood and precision. A Glendale electrician could wire any structure, but the market for those skills had contracted along with everything else. And every one of them knew that if the phone rang and the plant reopened, they'd be back on Queen Street the next morning. That was the cruelty of the idling. It kept hope alive just long enough to make the end hurt more. Meanwhile, Hannah and the management team were looking for a way out. Any way out. The company explored every option available to a Canadian manufacturer in distress. A buyer for the whole operation. A buyer for part of it. A strategic partner. A lender willing to extend a bridge. The consultants engaged by the board assessed the books, the market, the competitive landscape, and the probability of a recovery arriving in time to justify continued operations. Nobody came forward. No buyer wanted to take on a Canadian RV manufacturing operation in a market that had lost more than half its volume. No lender wanted to extend credit to an industry whose wholesale financing system was still in intensive care. The Strathroy plant, with its skilled workforce and its vertical integration and its 60 years of accumulated manufacturing knowledge, had no takers, not because it wasn't worth having, because the market it served had temporarily ceased to exist, and nobody was willing to bet on when or whether it would come back. What followed was the corporate process that precedes death. Glendale, in Hannah's words, undertook an extensive internal review and engaged outside consultants to assist it in reviewing all available options and strategies which it could pursue to rebuild the recreational vehicle division. The consultants came. They reviewed. They assessed. And the options weren't there. The Canadian RV market had contracted to a fraction of its former size. The American market, where Glendale had once exported, was punishing Canadian manufacturers with $1 at parity. The floor plan financing that dealers needed to stock Glendale units was still frozen or severely restricted. Even if the market recovered, and the signals were tentatively positive, there was no guarantee it would recover fast enough to stop the bleeding before the working capital ran out. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. A net loss of $3.1 million through 9 months, an idled plant still generating overhead costs, and $11.5 million in working capital that looked like a cushion but was really a countdown. At the current rate of losses, Glendale had perhaps 2 years of cash, 2 years of paying to keep a factory dark, of maintaining equipment that wasn't running, of holding inventory that wasn't selling, of waiting for a recovery that the board had no way of guaranteeing would arrive before the money was gone. The contrast with the automobile industry is where the tragedy sharpens into something that still stings. In 2008 and 2009, the Canadian and Ontario governments committed billions of dollars to keep General Motors and Chrysler alive. Emergency loans, equity purchases, restructuring support that ultimately totaled $13.3 billion in combined federal and provincial funds for GM alone. The argument was that the auto sector was too important, too many jobs, too deeply embedded in the Ontario economy to let it fail. And the argument had merit. The auto industry employed tens of thousands directly and hundreds of thousands in its supply chain, and its plants sat in ridings that mattered politically: Oshawa, Windsor, St. Catharines, Oakville. But the workers at Glendale, 40 minutes down Highway 402 from the auto corridor, worked the same kinds of skilled trades, lived in the same kinds of Ontario towns, and faced the same recession. A Glendale cabinet maker's skills were no less real than an Oshawa assembly worker's. A Strathroy family's mortgage was no less urgent than a Windsor family's. The difference was arithmetic, not the arithmetic of skill or need, but the arithmetic of numbers large enough to matter politically. The auto sector employed tens of thousands. Glendale employed roughly 200 across 2 plants. 200 was too many for the workers themselves to absorb. It was too few for Ottawa or Queen's Park to notice. There was no bailout for Glendale, no government rescue, no emergency credit line. No politician stood in the Strathroy plant and promised that 60 years of Canadian manufacturing would be saved. No one suggested that the taxpayer might bridge a debt-free company through an 18-month downturn the way they were bridging companies whose debt loads ran into the billions. The calculation that determines which industries get rescued and which are allowed to die is a calculation of political arithmetic, not justice, and Glendale was on the wrong side of it. Edward Hanna delivered the conclusion. Given that there does not appear to be a significant rebound of the Canadian RV industry and the commercial structure business for the energy sector in the near term, he stated, the board of directors determined that a voluntary assignment in bankruptcy was in the best interests of the corporation's stakeholders. Every director of the corporation resigned. Ernst & Young Inc. was appointed trustee. 60 years, 3 fires, 5 provinces, 120,000 units on the road, a factory full of people who'd cut their own wages to keep the lights on. Done. Chapter 9, January 20th. Glendale International Corp. filed a voluntary assignment in bankruptcy on January 20th, 2010. Not a restructuring, not a company's creditors arrangement act filing that might have allowed the business to reorganize, shed its losses, and emerge leaner on the other side. A straight bankruptcy, a liquidation. The legal mechanism that says, there is nothing left to save. Sell what remains and distribute the proceeds. The news broke the following day. Greg Keenan's report in the Globe and Mail carried the headline and the essential facts. A 60-year-old company, debt-free months earlier, brought down by forces entirely external to its own operations. Edward Hanna's bankruptcy statement cited the recent economic downturn, the rising Canadian dollar and higher gas prices, as having had a devastating effect on the recreational vehicle industry in North America. The language was measured, corporate, the kind of words that lawyers approve and accountants can defend. But underneath the measured language was a simple and terrible admission. Nothing the company had done wrong and nothing the company could do right would change what was happening to its market. The numbers in the filing confirmed what the workers already knew, that the RV division's revenue had collapsed, that losses had accumulated through 2008 and 2009, that the working capital, which had once seemed like a fortress, was being eroded quarter by quarter with no recovery in sight. In Strathroy, Martin Milhomans of the IMO called it a bit of a shock. The phrasing was characteristically understated. The Canadian register of someone absorbing a blow they'd half expected, but hoped wouldn't land. The Strathroy workers had given back $3.69 an hour. They'd watched the line slow. They'd been sent home on November 13th. But there had been a difference between idled and finished, and now that difference was gone. In Red Deer, Alberta, where the Travalair plant employed roughly 60 workers, the reaction was sharper. Nick Stewart, president of United Steelworkers Local 1207, looked at the same financial statements that everyone else was reading and pointed to what didn't add up. The company had working capital. It had cash. The balance sheet, by any normal reading, said this was a business that could survive. Stewart didn't say it in these words, but the implication was plain. Something beyond the numbers had killed this company. A decision had been made, by management, by the board, by whoever runs the arithmetic of survival, that the money in the bank wasn't enough to wait out a recovery that might or might not come. The filing itself was the simplest kind of corporate death, a voluntary assignment in bankruptcy, which meant the company was surrendering itself to its creditors and to the trustee, not fighting for a restructuring or seeking court protection to continue operating. Every director of the corporation had already resigned. There would be no reorganized Glendale emerging from bankruptcy protection. There would be no white knight buyer stepping in to restart the line. The company had looked for both. Hannah's internal review and the outside consultants had explored every option, and neither had materialized. What remained was the orderly disposal of what a 60-year-old company leaves behind when it stops existing, the loss registered differently at different scales. For the RV industry, it was one more casualty in a recession that had already killed 9 manufacturers. Significant, but not singular. For the Recreation Vehicle Dealers Association of Canada, it was the loss of the country's largest domestic manufacturer, a hole in the product landscape that American imports would fill without difficulty. For Middlesex County, it was another manufacturing plant gone from a region that had been losing them steadily for 2 decades. For the 200 people who had clocked in at 145 Queen Street or at the Red Deer plant, it was the end of a way of working. A Century Services release dated March 22, 2010, put the human cost into a single sentence. The bankruptcy resulted in the sudden unemployment of 200, leaving 2 manufacturing locations and brand new, unsold inventory. 200 people, roughly 100 in Strathroy, 60 in Red Deer, the rest scattered across head office and other operations. 200 paychecks that stopped arriving. 200 families that had to find something else in the middle of a recession that had already thinned the job postings to almost nothing. The workers in Strathroy had been through this before, not personally, most of them, but in the collective memory of a factory town. They knew what closure looked like. They'd watched it happen to other plants in other Ontario towns, one after another through the 90s and 2000s, as the manufacturing economy contracted around them. The auto parts suppliers, the textile mills, the food processing operations that consolidated and left. What they hadn't expected was that it would happen to Glendale, a company that was debt-free, that was management-owned, that had been running a profitable operation for decades. The shock wasn't just the job loss, it was the incomprehensibility. How do you explain to your family that the company had $11.5 million and still couldn't survive? For the Red Deer workers, the distance made it worse. The decisions had been made in Ontario by a board in Oakville about a company whose heart was in Strathroy. The Travalair plant in Red Deer had been part of Glendale since 1988, but it was always the western satellite, the acquisition, the second facility. When the lights went out, they went out from the east. The unsold inventory sat on the Strathroy lot and in dealer warehouses, finished recreational vehicles, fully built, waiting for buyers who couldn't get financing, and a market that had contracted by half. Brand new titanium fifth wheels. travel trailers with the Glendale name on the side, units that had been assembled by workers who no longer had jobs, in a factory that would never run again. Each one represented raw materials purchased, labor paid, craftsmanship applied, and no sale at the other end. They sat in the winter cold, collecting snow on their roofs, their slide-outs retracted, their interiors dark, the solid surface countertops and the reclining chairs and the central vacuum systems all waiting for owners who would never come. Even as the bankruptcy unfolded, Eleanor Ham of the Recreation Vehicle Dealers Association of Canada maintained that the market appeared to be turning a corner. She was right, eventually. The North American RV industry would recover, slowly, through 2010 and 2011 and beyond, climbing back toward and eventually surpassing its pre-crisis volumes. But eventually is a word that means nothing to a company that's already dead. The timing was the cruelest part. Glendale filed in January 2010, and the recovery it needed was perhaps 18 months away. Close enough to see, too far to reach. Ernst & Young, as trustee, inventoried the assets. Century Services Inc. appraised the Strathroy plant and the Red Deer facility, the tooling, the equipment, the vacuum-forming machines that had been part of Glendale's identity since the 1960s. They cataloged the unsold RV inventory, brand new units that would be sold at auction for whatever the market would bear, which in the spring of 2010 was considerably less than the cost of building them. They assessed the intellectual property, the patents, the designs, the brand names that had been accumulating since Reg Thorne registered the Glendale name 60 years earlier. The work of dismembering a company takes time. From January to April, Glendale existed in the liminal state between death and disposal. The corporate name still on the wall at 145 Queen Street. The shipping doors still closed. The parking lot still empty except for the trustees' cars and the occasional visitor who came to look at what was for sale. Inside, the factory was frozen in place. The vacuum-forming equipment still sat where it had operated. The woodshop tools still waited in their stations. The jigs and fixtures that held RV components during assembly, custom-built for Glendale models, useless to anyone building anything else, lined the floor like monuments to a specific way of making things. All of it appraised, tagged, cataloged, and prepared for buyers who would judge it by weight and condition, not by what it had built. In April 2010, it all went to auction. The machinery that had built 120,000 recreational vehicles was sold to the highest bidder. The patents that had made the titanium the most innovative fifth wheel in Canada were sold to the highest bidder. The building at 145 Queen Street, the factory that Reg Thorne had rebuilt after the 1966 fire, the building that had housed Canada's largest RV manufacturer for more than 4 decades, was sold. The brand names, Glendale, Golden Falcon, Titanium, Travel Air, all of them were sold. 60 years of Canadian manufacturing reduced to lots in an auction catalog. The highest bidder for the titanium patents was in Indiana. Chapter 10. The patents go south. The building survived. Buildings usually do. 145 Queen Street, Strathroy, Ontario, is an active manufacturing facility today. But what it manufactures has nothing to do with recreational vehicles. The building houses Meridian Lightweight Technologies, a magnesium die casting operation that makes auto parts for the automotive supply chain. The shell that built Canada's RVs now feeds the industry that, 40 minutes down Highway 402, received the government bailout that Glendale never got. The irony is quiet, but it's there. The same skilled trades workers, the same kind of Ontario manufacturing town, the same type of building, different product, different owners, different story. The titanium patents, the cab-over design that had given a 32-foot trailer the living space of a 37-footer, the engineering that had made Glendale's flagship product the dominant fifth wheel in the Canadian market, went to Heartland Recreational Vehicles of Elkhart, Indiana. In January 2011, Heartland revived the cab-over front cap in its Bighorn fifth wheel line, and later embedded the technology in its Road Warrior and Cyclone toy hauler models. The Canadian innovation that Glendale's engineers had patented for Glendale's 50th anniversary was now a feature of American-built recreational vehicles, manufactured in the RV capital of the world, sold across a continent that had once bought them from Strathroy. Heartland itself didn't remain independent for long. Thor Industries, the world's largest recreational vehicle manufacturer, acquired Heartland for $100 million in cash plus 4.3 million shares of Thor common stock, with the deal closing in September 2010. The titanium technology thus passed from a Canadian management-owned company through bankruptcy to an Indiana manufacturer to a global conglomerate, each step carrying it further from the factory floor where it had been conceived and the workers who had built it. The Canadian RV industry didn't disappear entirely. It contracted, and it moved west. Triple E of Winkler, Manitoba, survived the recession, but only by discontinuing its Class A motorhomes, its travel trailers, and its fifth wheels, and refocusing entirely on smaller, fuel-efficient Class B and Class C motorhomes. Pleasureway in Saskatoon kept building. Bigfoot and Northern Light continued in British Columbia. These were niche manufacturers, specialists who'd found defensible corners of the market. None of them attempted what Glendale had been, a full-range, full-scale RV manufacturer competing head-to-head with Elkhart across every product category. With Glendale gone, Eastern Canada lost its major recreational vehicle manufacturer. The factory that had anchored Strathroy's industrial identity, that had given a small Ontario town a connection to a national industry, that had put the Glendale name on 120,000 units rolling across the country. That factory was making magnesium castings now. The workers scattered the way factory workers always scatter when the plant closes in a small town. Some found work at other manufacturing operations in Middlesex County and the London area, the auto parts plants, the food processing facilities, the light industrial shops that still dotted southwestern Ontario. Some retrained. Some retired early, if their age and their savings allowed it. Some left Strathroy altogether, following the work the way workers have always followed the work in this country, east or west, wherever the next paycheck was. What they carried with them was a set of skills: cabinetry, electrical, plumbing, metalwork, plastics fabrication, that had been sharpened over years on a factory floor where you couldn't hide behind a single repetitive task. Those skills were worth something. Whether the market was willing to pay what they were worth was a different question. The trailers Glendale had built were still out there, aging in campgrounds and driveways, traded on used lots, cherished by owners who knew what they had. A lost Glendale trailer graveyard of decaying units in a private Ontario campground, documented by the automotive blog Curbside Classic, offered a visual that said more than any financial statement. Rows of Golden Falcons and Glendettes and older models, their aluminum siding dulling, their tires flat, parked in the grass, as if someone had meant to come back for them and never did. The enthusiast communities endured. The Tin Can tourists kept Reg Thorne's 1986 interview in their archives. The Titanium RV Owners Group still connected owners of the fifth wheel that had been Glendale's crowning achievement. A vintage Glendale trailer group on Facebook collected photographs of the models from the 50s and 60s and 70s, the eras when the Golden Falcon was new, and the idea of a Canadian-made trailer was as unremarkable and as reliable as the summer itself. Chapter 11. The Curve in the Road. The Glendale Curve still exists. The bend where Warncliffe Road meets Southdale Road on the south side of London, Ontario, is just a stretch of suburban road now. Houses, traffic, the ordinary landscape of a mid-sized Canadian city spreading outward the way they all do. There's no plaque, no marker, nothing to tell you that in 1950, in a barn that used to stand somewhere near here, an English immigrant named Reginald Lever Thorne started building travel trailers and gave his company the name of the curve it sat on. The barn is gone. The barn burned 60 years before the company did. 145 Queen Street is still standing. The shipping doors are still there, not 54 of them anymore in active use. But the building is the building. Different name on the wall, different product inside, different workers arriving in the morning, different trucks backing up to the loading bays, different sounds on the floor. But the same concrete under their feet, the same roof over their heads, the same small-town Ontario sky outside the windows. Glendale Recreational Vehicles survived 3 major fires. It survived the loss of its founder. It survived 2 ownership changes and a management buyout. It survived the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, which between them handed 85% of the Canadian RV market to American manufacturers. It survived 60 winters in a town 35 kilometers west of London, building things that Canadians hitched to their trucks and took to the lake. It did not survive the moment when the credit that connected it to its customers froze solid. A company that owed nothing. A factory that made things people wanted. A workforce that cut its own wages to keep the lights on. None of it was enough, because the thing that killed Glendale wasn't inside the building. It was in the lending offices of institutions that had never seen a titanium fifth wheel, never walked a Strathroy factory floor, never met a single one of the 200 people whose livelihoods depended on the continued willingness of a bank to lend money to a dealer, so that a family could buy a trailer, so that a factory could keep running. The titanium's cab-over design is still in production. You can buy it today, built in Elkhart, Indiana, wearing a different name. The Canadian patent that made it possible crossed the border the way so many Canadian things cross the border. Not because it failed, but because the structure that supported it gave way underneath. Somewhere in Canada tonight, a Glendale trailer sits in a campground, or in a driveway, or at the back of a storage lot, bearing a name that hasn't been painted on anything new in more than 16 years. The aluminum has dulled, the decals have faded, but the cabinet doors still close the way they did when a Strathroy cabinet maker hung them, and the tanks still hold because they were vacuum formed on Queen Street from ABS plastic by people who knew what they were doing. 120,000 of them once. Fewer now. Fewer every year. The last trailer already rolled off the line. Nobody's building the next one.